Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. My name is Nozi Pombanjwa and we're coming to you from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. On today's episode, we're going to be focusing on the investment case for development. The African Development Week is a meeting between African Union ministers and the Economic Commission for Africa, and they're meeting here in Addis Ababa this week. We caught up with the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. His name is Dr. Carlos Lopez, and he explained to us the importance of this gathering and the key issues that were put on the agenda.
Well, this is like a federation of many events that we used to have, in a non-structured way. Like, for instance, there is a regional coordination mechanism, which is when the UN agencies dialogue with the African Union. There is the former heads of state of Africa forum. There is a meeting of statisticians, and you name it. Number of meetings that now come together to do this very exciting program of a development week. For me, what is new and exciting in particular is the fact that we have really positioned the debate around knowledge and research pieces that were not available before. At least they were not available made by Africans. So we have now a huge number of publications that are launched during this week that are like the cement for a more robust discussion.
Well, let's talk about one of those publications, and one certainly that's going to get a lot of attention because it touches on that sticky topic of corruption, and this is the Africa Governance Report. Firstly, Mr. Lopez, the rationale behind this particular report and why now?
Well, people have become familiar with the Mo Ibrahim Index that ranks countries in terms of their governance performance in Africa. And it's a very interesting experiment that we are very proud also to be part of. What this report does is slightly different. This is more the qualitative discussion, not the index discussion. And this qualitative discussion moves from one theme to another, trying to look into aspects of governance that really make a difference in Africa. Last time it was managing diversity and elections. Very important topic. This year is about corruption. And immediately people think, they are going to do something along the lines of what Transparency International does and others are very busy doing. And not at all. What we are trying is actually to see what is the benefit of all these indexes? Where are they focused? Are they really related to facts? And we found out that most of them are perception-based. And therefore, they are not very accurate in the way they judge Africa. And because Africa is already minimized in so many fronts, this is just one more. Is this to say that we don't have corruption? No, we do. But we want, through this report, to put the finger where it does make a difference. We say mostly it's external induced corruption is responsible for illicit financial flows. And the rest is the making of very bad fiscal and tax systems. So let's tackle those. And this is what I think the report really tries to achieve, to shift the discussion where it belongs. So we definitely see progress in the fight against corruption.
The final consumption point of this particular report, who will be making decisions off the basis of these thematic areas that are coming out of the report?
Well, we see a role for many actors. Of course, governments have a big responsibility, but it will be a mistake to think that only governments have a responsibility. A lot of the corruption is actually practiced by the private sector. The bribes come from those who have the money. It's a two-way traffic. So it is very important for us to also create regulatory systems, transparency rules, a judiciary that works, that will allow for the different fronts to be tackled. And the report goes into the detail of how this can be achieved and also gives some good practices that have already been put in place in some countries.
In order to move towards faster development, Africa has identified trade and industry as one of the key interventions at a regional and a continental level. And speaking to this very theme, we caught up with Her Excellency Fatima Haram Asel. She is the Commissioner responsible for trade and industry at the African Union.
yes, intra-African trade is very low compared to the other region of the world. When you talk about Europe, I mean, you're talking about 60%, Asia, 40% and so forth. So it's very, very low at 12%. Even, our trade with the rest of the world is very, very marginal. It's 3%. So, the lowest ever. And it's very, very important that we really do increase our, intra-African trade. And why is it important? It's important because we can actually, diversify our economy. We can, actually trade, finished goods through that regional value chain. We can actually ease up, our, cross-border trades. So movement of people and, of trade facilitation. When we talk about trade facilitation with the rest of the world, it's important that we talk about trade facilitation within ourselves. And everybody knows that Africa is endowed with natural resources. Everybody knows that Africa is so important. Investors want to come. But we're not realizing our own strength. We're not realizing that, yes, we may produce the same thing. However, if we start, stop trading really just raw commodities, shipping raw material, across and not creating any value, not creating any jobs, not, getting the revenue that required for our infrastructure and so forth, we will continue to be the fragmented Africa, the divided Africa, the small economies, and we can never speak about one Africa, one continental market, one regional, integration agenda. So, but when you talk about, country A can, actually transform, certain commodity to certain extent, then you go to country B and then you add it, and, that encourage this type of made in Africa concept. That means that, actually you can trade more, finished goods.
Yeah.
It means that you're creating employment in the continent. It means that actually you're creating movement of talent, movement of people, and it's actually the issue of also being proud that we consume made in Africa. We have the population here. The demand is in Africa. We're talking about an Africa that is going to have a middle class. Everybody wants our market, and we need to reflect in what do we need to do so that we can also capture that demand of our markets that everybody is trying to come and compete for.
We've seen it from a political level that in the forms of declarations and agreements that there is a political desire to get this regional value chain that you speak about, but practically on the ground, away from the political podiums, what are the 3 or 4 most important things that you think we need to focus on to get this regional value chain right?
For example, for me as a Commissioner of Trade, I spoke, for example, to a company, what is it again called? And just to say, for example, they're in West Africa. And I was saying to them that I was saying to Nestle, listen, if you want us to just have, memorandum of understanding between the African Union Commission and so forth, and just to really talk about industrialization, all of these things, but really cheap talk, we're not interested. We're interested in, what do we need to do in order for us to produce something. For example, I gave them the example. We produce cocoa in Africa. Since we produce cocoa in Africa, it may not make business sense for you as a Nestle to produce chocolate in Africa. But can we produce our own chocolate, the one that we consume in Africa? So what I want is just let's study, take the cocoa from Africa, take everything, like the cost of production in Africa, and tell me, how much market do you require? Is it just in West Africa? Is it West and Central Africa? Is it the whole Africa? How much access to the market that require? What do you need us to relax, for example, on trade facilitation so that we can move your product across? And that's mean that when you move your product across, you can make your profit. But in the meantime, you have to tell us also, when we do that, when we relax our, custom procedures, when, the chocolate from Cote d'Ivoire can enter easily in Nigeria and in Chad and in other countries, how many jobs are you creating? And then we can bring the Minister of, Industry, Minister of Trade, and then we can talk about, let's take a business, case like this, like the issue of the chocolate. What does it require? And I think that we will be very happy. Maybe that more African children can consume chocolate. That is one. And secondly, it's like, the issue of made in Africa. It's just like having the proudness of making it in Africa.
Let's take a short break, but when we come back, we continue our conversations here in Addis Ababa, really exploring the investment case for development. Welcome back to Invest Africa. We're in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and we're exploring the investment case for development. Now, one of the prominent voices that I was able to speak to is Franny Lotia. She's the chairperson of Mkoba Private Equity. Coming out of a meeting chaired by the chairperson of the African Union, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, and a range of African Union ministers, she shared with us the strategies and the big ideas around how Africa can create buffers to further insulate itself from global market shocks.
The chairperson of the African Union Commission really launched the challenge to the panelists and the ministers who were in the discussion on how we can actually understand better the crisis that Africa is facing, particularly with low commodity prices, declining demand for many of the commodities that Africa exports, the impact it has on revenues and the debt levels that we are now facing, but also the climate-related risks, including flooding and droughts, and whether what have we learned, how are we managing, are there countries that are doing better and can we learn from them, and how can we be better prepared, not only for the short term, but also for the medium and long term. So my task in that conversation was to share perspectives on three key dimensions. The first one is based on a book that I have recently published on leadership in a globalized world, complexity, dynamics and risks, because it really looks at how leaders can develop the capabilities and the tools and the approaches to handling complexity and risk in a globalized world. And the three risks that we were looking at were really impacting Africa not only at the national level, but also in the way Africa interacts with itself as a continent and with the rest of the world. So that was the first aspect that I covered, and the books were circulated around to the ministers who were participating for further reading and skill development. The second big component was on suggestions and ideas of where things have worked, including the role that the private sector in investment has played. So the examples that were shared included, for example, the innovations in finance and how through blended finance, public-private partnerships, better using our sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, private equity, and combining these instruments to support small and medium enterprises, the small farmer, and the big companies that can help transform African economies so that we are not so dependent on commodities and not so dependent on agriculture. So the role that the private sector plays in that was one of the things that we discussed. The second, on the examples of where things have worked, I shared some examples of countries that I have seen as looking at deal sourcing in these countries and finding that they've really done an incredible job in terms of dealing with these crises, like Rwanda, and how they have used the transformation of the agricultural sector through the dairy value chain, getting cows to each families, getting milk production up, and then milk processing and exports, which is a key area. Uganda, which has used science and technology very effectively, using model farmers to transmit ideas in a way that is quite effective to other farmers because they can speak the same language. How South Africa has worked with competitive grants to small and medium enterprises in the agricultural value chain, supporting them to tap into the global export value chain, but also to work within the domestic economy and grow. Examples like Nigeria, which launched a commodity exchange for cassava, one of the most consumed products, which allowed the price fluctuation to be managed, the variability in the price to be managed, but also to transform the product to include making starch out of the cassava and preserving it in the form of chips so that you don't have to always wait for the next crop because the crop doesn't stay very well. And the examples where the service sector can also contribute to that, because Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was there. And one of the examples I share about her is when she went on television and started to talk about recipes on how you make bread from cassava.
Right.
And the wheat imports then went down because families started to bake bread with a mix of wheat and cassava. Tastes very good, more nutritious, and less demanding on foreign imports, which helped to manage the fluctuating currency and the negative impact of the declining commodity prices. There were many other examples, but that really was the summary of the session. What came out of it is a communique that will be circulated during the formal meeting tomorrow, and it would also form the basis of the upcoming meeting in Kigali of the African Union, so that the issues can move from discussion and learning to implementation.
Do you get a sense that Africa is moving in the right direction in terms of building the buffers that require us to not be so exposed to movements in global markets? Are we making the right decisions for the future?
I think, as usual, you cannot talk about Africa as a unitary thing. Different countries are doing different things, and there are some countries that are quite successful. Others are still struggling, and the key issue is how we can get all the countries to learn from each other and to coordinate better. So I'd say, for example, Africa did a tremendous job in macroeconomic stability for 15 years, and that's what has underpinned the growth that we saw in the last 15 years, and even the very quick rebound from the financial crisis. And I think this is what is helping Africa going forward, even with the low commodity prices and the declining demand. That meant very solid inflation management, solid currency management, incredible fundamentals in the macroeconomic sphere, and then being able to bridge all of those with a smart approach to debt management. The challenge we have is that new crises have come on board, and I think the one we have not handled as well is removing ourselves from the dependency on weather. And therefore the impact of climate change is hurting us not only in agriculture because of the drought and floods, but also cities who are hurt when there's flooding, and of course the energy sector that is depending on hydroelectricity. So these correlated risks are what are causing a huge headache for many countries. And then the other area we have not progressed as well is in developing bigger regional food markets. And one of the things that has worked quite effectively for the countries that have used it is the Africa Risk Capacity instrument, where it's an insurance instrument that countries pay in, and when they have a drought event, they take a payout. So Senegal used it recently, got close to $17 million to manage the crisis. That's why you haven't heard of famine or drought crisis in Senegal, because they were able to use the funding that they got from this facility. Mozambique also was able to do it, but not all countries are members, so we're still behind in that regard. And the last thing I would say is people gave the example of Japan, saying how can we become like Japan and be ready. Japan is very good in dealing with earthquakes because they've been having earthquakes for many years, so whenever an earthquake happens, from the community level all the way up and down, coordinated response very fast. And the issue that shook them is the crisis with Fukushima, a nuclear crisis, a different kind of crisis. And so we were discussing how Africa can learn not only from that, because we have our own examples here, where Mozambique, for instance, did very well in managing drought on one river basin system, but when the drought happened on another river basin system, the community level support networks were not prepared. So we have to continually learn and continually improve. So I think the story really that came out of today was we are doing well on average, but there are some countries that are doing better and some not as well. We could learn from each other, and we need coordinated responses because some of these risks are counter-cyclical, and they are correlated. So we have to coordinate how we act so that we can achieve a positive outcome for multiple countries, because some countries can also take actions that would hurt other countries.
Industrialization has been identified as one of the key variables towards Africa's development. But a man with a different idea on how we can industrialize is Dr. Emmanuel Nandozi from the African Capacity Building Foundation.
Well, you see, we started with a basic argument. We say that we have to stop saying, how do you diversify out of the primary sector, commodity sector? And instead saying, how do you industrialize based on your primary commodities? Because already this is what you have and what you're already exporting. The only problem is that you don't add value to it and you don't gain a lot of benefits from income and from growth and from jobs. That's what the problem is. And before then, people were arguing that if you want to add value, if you want to industrialize in your primary commodities, you may not have the technical capacity. It's very capital intensive, it's this and that and that. But our analysis shows that it is possible, that it's actually doable, and that some countries in Africa are doing it. And we're talking about soft commodities and hard commodities. Soft ones are things like agricultural commodities, coffee, tea, flowers, and so on and so forth. The hard ones are, of course, starting with gold and diamonds and oil and copper and etc. That there are two things that can happen here. One is that you can add value before you export. So it means getting into the value chain, either the global one or the local one. So instead of shipping out raw beans, you can transform it to the next level, and gradually you get there. So value addition. The second one is, rather than having the copper mines and their producers import every service and every input they need for copper production, they can source them locally. And so they're linking to the local economy, building entrepreneurs and getting people to get jobs.
Prof, I want to come back to the context that we find ourselves in, where there's been a literal collapse of commodity prices.
Yes.
Is it difficult or harder to sell this line of thinking given the challenges of the current environment?
Actually, this collapse of the prices makes it imperative. This is the best opportunity for no longer postponing it or saying it's impossible. Because if countries had gotten into the higher value chains, they would not be so vulnerable to the collapse of the prices. Because the crude oil may collapse, the price of other oil products are not suffering the same way. You see what I mean? Did you see diamond prices collapse in the diamond that you wear in your ring collapse in the market? The answer is no. But the raw diamonds, the prices have gone down. So you insulate yourself from this volatility or this negative effects of price shocks by making sure that you are up in the higher value chain, because that's where you have more stability, and that's also where you can still continue to do something. For example, a lot of the countries here are oil exporters, but they import fuel, they import gasoline, they import kerosene, they import finished products. So they have a domestic demand for these things.
Yeah.
The only thing is that they are not transforming it so they can sell to the domestic market. So if the global market is not working, you at least have something to fall back on.
Prof, the beneficiation and the value addition argument has been around for some time, and critics will always point to the lack of technology, as you've said, and the fact that we're maybe not as competitive as markets such as India. We've heard all of those, but from your point of view, how do you get started? What are the key priorities that you believe African governments should be focused on if we're really going to see real value addition along the value chain?
Thank you very much. This report that I referred to that we did in 2013 spells this out very clearly. First of all, you have to understand the nature of the global value chains and ask yourself, where realistically can I start? Not at the base, but is it the next level or this next second level on that? We're not talking about being at the top level, right get go, except maybe you're a country that has the capacity to do that. But understanding it, first of all, and then put in place the kind of mechanisms that will bring incentives for both those multinationals who are already doing this to begin to help. I'll begin to pay attention to value addition and so on and so forth. But it's a dialogue, but at the same time, you have to form some kind of coalition of group of people within the country, interministerial plus other stakeholders, who will come and advise the government to say specifically, we can be able to do this and do that, or we can get it to this level of the value chain, and then you start implementing it.
Africa's development is top of the agenda for the Economic Commission for Africa and the African Union. But the question is, can they sell the story to investors? Thank you for joining us from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. For myself and the team, it's goodbye.